Well, you're probably looking at your notes and thinking, where is Revelation? Well, with our group, so many of our group is next door tonight. They're packaging up Christmas boxes, and so many of our adults are over there tonight with the children and the youth that are doing that. And so I didn't want to get back into Revelation with them over there. We're about to move into chapter 18, and then so I started looking at it, and I said, well, next Wednesday night, just want to remind you, next Wednesday night is our community Thanksgiving service that will be held at Beach Springs. We'll be at 6 o'clock at Beach Springs Baptist Church next Wednesday night, and they'll be providing the music, and I'll be preaching, and so that will be next Wednesday night at 6. And then we just start running into Thanksgiving and Christmas, and so what I've decided to do is I've decided to wait and get back into Revelation 18 in January, and then we will take a running start and get on through the book. But for the 2 Wednesday nights that we don't have other special activities, I want to speak to you from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Tonight we're going to be looking at verses 7 through 10, a very familiar passage, okay? This is not something you have not heard. It's not something you haven't studied before. But it's been something that's been on my mind and heart, and so I've decided we're going to take 2 Wednesday nights to do this. And so I want to ask the question, has anybody in here ever had a disruptive moment in your life? All of us, right? Everybody here has had what we might consider to be a disruptive moment. Might be a disruptive month, a disruptive year, or whatever it may be. A time in your life where you feel like that the furnace has been cut up on your life. Warren Wiersbe, who is of Moody Bible Institute, he's gone to glory now. But Warren Wiersbe put it this way. He said, when God permits His children to go through the furnace, He keeps His eye on the clock and His hand on the thermostat. I think that's important for us to know. Because everybody in here has been through the difficult time in life. But it's, to me, comforting to know that God's got His eyes on it. God's got His eyes on the clock. He knows how high He can push that thermostat. Now, I think that comes from His loving heart, that He knows how much and He knows how long. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why would God do that? Why would God allow us to be put into the furnace, so to speak? Why would He take the thermostat in our life and crank it up a notch? There's some reasons for God doing that in the life of a child of God. Now you think about the Apostle Paul, who's writing about this. Paul was so gifted. There's not been a more gifted missionary, a more gifted theologian than the Apostle Paul. And yet, here he's going to find himself over and over again being persecuted, being put into prison, not able to be about doing the work that he so desired to do. And so I want to tell you, I think that the Apostle Paul would have to be saying sometimes, why? Why, God, would you make me, you know the work that I'm trying to do for you, why would you make it where I can't even get out of prison to be able to do the work? But what would God tell him? God would tell him, Paul, my grace is sufficient for you. For my strength is made perfect in weakness. Now I want you to look at 2 Corinthians, I'll get over there too. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, and we're going to look beginning at verse 7. And this is what he said. And he says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations." Not just one revelation, not just one vision, many. Paul has had many visions, many revelations, things that probably most of us have not experienced, and most in that day had not experienced. But he says, "A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that he might let it depart from me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Do you see one of the reasons why God's allowing this to happen to the Apostle Paul? "Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in needs, in persecution, in distress, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." I wonder how many of us could honestly read that last verse and say, "Hey, amen to that." We probably don't want to, do we? Where he says, "I take pleasure. I take pleasure in infirmities. I take pleasure in reproaches, in needs, in persecution and distresses for Christ's sake." That was Paul's view of it. Now, somewhere along your path, you've incurred these moments. You may be in one right now. You may be in one of those times right now where it is a disruptive time in your life. But you've all been through it. Suddenly, sometimes, have you noticed these things can come very suddenly? Have you noticed that sometimes these moments can be where everything's rocking along just fine in your life, and bam, there's the circumstance. There's the difficult time. I can vouch for that, and you've heard me speak about this in my own life. I can vouch for this. When I was 22 years old, and I get a phone call that my daddy has died. Bam. Life change, just like that. Total, absolute shock. Sometimes we get those types of situations in our life. You're faced with things you never expected to face. You're faced with things that you do not desire to face. Things that you do not want to encounter, you would not wish to encounter. In fact, you would have chosen, I know I would have, chosen to avoid it altogether. Chosen to avoid some of these things. Well, few of us have grasped the truth like the Apostle Paul. Few of us have grasped the fact that this suffering refines us. He understood that. He understood that suffering refines him, that suffering would be something that would purify him. Suffering was something that would give him wisdom. And probably all of us can now maybe look back at some of those situations in our life and say, man, that was a time of growth in my life. And I can look back at situations in my life where I can say, man, I didn't ask for it, didn't want it, didn't like it when I was going through it, but I can look back at it now and I can see where God was moving and working in my life through it. So we think about Paul's visions. He says here, he uses that term in the plural. We pretty typically, when we think about this verse, these verses, we think about his vision of heaven, right? We think about the fact that he was given a vision of heaven. Now he said, whether or not I was actually there, or whether it was a vision, I'm not sure, is what he's saying. He said, I don't know if I was actually taken there or if this was just a vision that God had given to me. But this is the vision we sort of typically think about, where he goes into the third heaven. By the way, mankind has been in the first heaven, the clouds. When you travel on an airplane, you go into the first heaven, you get up above the clouds. Mankind has traveled into the second heaven, where you would be traveling in space. But mankind cannot travel into the third heavens. We cannot get to God unless God provides a way to do that. And of course, we know ultimately the way that is through Christ, that we're actually going to get to the heaven where God is. But Paul had other visions. He had the vision of on the road to Damascus, didn't he? Did he see the Lord? I believe he saw the Lord. He saw the Lord on the way to Damascus. He had a vision then that was given to him that a man by the name of Ananias was going to come to him and was going to minister to him. Remember, he was blinded and he was in great need, and God would send Ananias to him to give ministry to him. He would also have another vision. Somebody help me out. He'd have another vision where he was on his missionary journey, and God gave him a vision to go where? The Macedonian call. He gave him the vision to go to Macedonia. He was headed in a certain particular way, and God said, no, you're not going to go over to Asia, you're going to Macedonia. God gave him the Macedonian call, and that was a vision that he received. He was in Corinth, and he was deeply discouraged while he was in Corinth. The work was tough, the people were difficult, but we know that the Lord came to him in a vision and let him know that it was going to be okay, that he was with him, and that he was going to continue to be with him as he ministered. There was another time he had a vision when he was in Jerusalem. Had a vision in Jerusalem, and things were hot and heavy in Jerusalem, and he encouraged him by this vision in Jerusalem. He was in the midst of the sea after having a shipwreck, or as the ship was being wrecked. And God gave him a vision. What did he give him the vision of? The vision was everything's going to be okay. And he would preach that. He would tell that to everybody on board, that there was a reason for this happening and that everything was going to be okay. But there was these revelations that were given to him, and he says here that there was a reason for God to give him this thorn in the side because of all these visions he had had. Lest he become what? Prideful, boastful, arrogant. That probably some of us maybe, and I'm including myself, it would say, well, I've had this vision and you haven't had that. I've experienced this and you've not experienced that. That's prideful, isn't it? That's arrogance. And so he was given the thorn in the side to prevent this arrogance. So the first thing I want you to notice is the purpose of these moments. The purpose of these moments in our life. The purpose of the moment that it was for the Apostle Paul. The first thing I would say is it was to protect him from pride. It was to protect him from pride. He had been granted an opportunity to be caught up into the heavens. Now, when he writes this, he looks back and he says it was 14 years before. It was 14 years before this. So Paul has had to keep his mouth shut about a vision of heaven for 14 years. God said, don't say it, don't repeat what you've heard. God allowed him to be able to hear some of the conversation of heaven. And he says, don't say a word. That would be really tough for us to hold a secret for 14 years. But he held it. He didn't say anything, didn't give any details about what had happened. So he'd been granted this opportunity, caught up into the heavens. No other person had ever experienced this, and he could have become very proud. So that was the purpose of this disruptive moment. Maybe that's the case for sometimes in our lives when we have a disruptive moment where maybe we're riding along and things are just going so good and we're so just getting to the point of being prideful even. And God says, okay, there's going to be a painful moment here. You see, God knows when. Not all moments are regarding that. But sometimes we have those moments to protect us from getting too prideful. The second thing is that there's the pain of a disruptive moment. The pain of the disruptive moment. Now scholars have spent many hours speculating on what was the pain for Paul. Now I want to tell you that it's almost foolish to speculate because we're not told. It's amazing to me that scholars would spend a whole lot of time in trying to figure out what was it that was the pain, that was the thorn in the flesh. What was that for him? There's been different speculations, and I'm not going to speculate tonight. I've heard some, I've even mentioned some before, but I'm not even going to mention that tonight because it really doesn't matter what it was. But there was a pain. And it was a reoccurring type of thing that was going on in his life that stayed with him, whether it was physical or spiritual or emotional or whatever. But he was one that would experience the thorn being put in the side, it says here, this thorn in the side. You know what that word thorn means? That word thorn means a stake. Like you're hammering a stake in the ground. We're not talking about a little thorn off a thorn bush that will catch you sometimes. He says that this is so big and that this is so painful, it is like a stake that has been driven into my life. A thorn in his side. Paul is saying it was something that was huge that was driven into his flesh. And then like I said, the details are beside the point. Now, what my curiosity would be, I would like to know, but why would God not let us know? Why do you think? What might be a reason you think? Let me tell you what I speculate. I speculate so that we can put our name into this and our experience into this. So, we don't know what it was with Paul. But we know what it has been for us. We know that thorn in the flesh sometimes that it's been for us. Some difficulties that God has allowed. Some difficulties that God has allowed into our life. We know what those are. But God says here, so you fill in the blank. Whatever it is, you fill in the blank. But God's grace, he says, is sufficient for me and for you to deal with whatever it is. So you know those things that you're going through right now. You know those things you're going through right now or that you have gone through. God's saying, my grace is sufficient for you. And then there's a third thing, and that is that there is a provision. There is a provision for the disruptive moment. Look at verse 9. Provision. And he says again, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. So he asked God 3 times. 3 times he goes to God. Now, I want to tell you what I think. I think this was passionate pleading with God. I don't think it was just sort of haphazardly asking God, would you maybe think about removing this? I'm thinking he's going before God and he's passionately praying, say, God, would you remove this from me? 3 different times. God ever tell you no? God's told me no plenty of times. There have been times I've gone to God and God, I've asked for this, and God said no. Does that mean God's not hearing? Does that mean God's not answering? No. He's answered. Sometimes God says no. When you, as a parent, have you ever had to say no to your children? Hello? You've had to, haven't you? When you were growing up, mom and dad said, look, I said over and over again, I want a motorcycle. I want a motorcycle. They said no. Over and over and over again. And they would say, when you get out of the house, if that's what you want to get, you get it. But not while you're in this house. We're not getting it. No. So God says no sometimes, doesn't he? Some of the things that we just think we have to have. God's answer is no. And for him it was no. He would not remove the thorn, but he would give Paul all the grace that he would need to continue on his work. Let me ask you this. Did Paul stop working? No. Did he stay busy? Yes. Did he keep on going? Yes. Was he in pain of some sort? Yes. But God gave him enough grace to be able to keep on going. He promised him also that his strength would be made perfect in weakness. In other words, you will have power in the midst of your pain. You're going to have the pain, but I'm going to give you the power, and you're going to be strengthened in your time of weakness. And then there's the product of the disruptive moment. The product is that you will have grace and strength to do your job. You will have grace and strength to be able to do your job. Your weakness will serve. My weakness and your weakness will serve to do what regarding God? Glorify him. It will, the weaker we become and he brings us through things, then he gets what? More glory. Our weakness means more glory unto the Lord. And that's what he was saying regarding Paul. No one will be able to explain your power and your strength. Have you ever looked at somebody and you said, that there's a believer and they're going through a hard time. Have you ever said of them, how are you doing this? I have. I've looked at him, I've spoke to him, I've said, how are you making it through this? And then to hear them say, there's only one way, and that is the Lord God. So in their weakness and in their pain, God is receiving glory. I see Miss Judy out there in the foyer. Mr. Billy and Miss Judy, every time I talk to them, no matter what they're going through, they're hurting, but they still giving glory to God. They said, we're making it because of God. And that's where we need to understand that, we need to learn that lesson, and that when we're going through those things, when we pray, God help me, that what I'm going through, may you get glory during this time. No one will be able to explain your power and your strength in human terms. The weaker that we are, his grace is revealed. Someone put it like this: when this little light of mine grows dimmer, his floodlight shines brighter. That little light of ours sometimes gets dim, doesn't it? But boy, God's got the floodlight that he'll shine on our lives, and God gets glory. And then there's the perspective of the disruptive moment. There's a perspective of the disruptive moment. You look at verse 9 again. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Paul is saying, I'm not the man I used to be. He said, I'm not the man I used to be. I've suffered pain, but I've grown spiritually like never before. That's what Paul's saying in his life. He's experienced pain and suffering, but he's growing spiritually. And he says this, he says, I have entered into the fellowship of Christ's sufferings. Sunday, we said that we are called upon as disciples to deny ourselves and take up the cross and follow him. That is exactly what Paul's doing here. That's exactly what he's saying here. That in the midst of his infirmities, he is now experiencing the fellowship of Christ's sufferings. And you know what he's saying here too? He said, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Now, we would have that attitude sometimes. Maybe we would trade some of the things that we've gone through. We would trade it. But if we've grown in the Lord and God has received glory for it, Paul would say, I wouldn't trade that for anything. Paul is saying here, I have a thorn in my side. But that thorn in my side has become a badge of honor. Not for me, Paul says, but it has become a badge of honor unto the Lord. Then let me ask you this as we close. We're going to close and we're going to pray. But was Paul a passive man? Was he passive? I don't think so. Was he a weak man? No. Now, some people would say regarding Paul, the false teachers would say, man, Paul, you are a great writer and you write tremendously powerful letters, but when you get here in person, you are not impressive. That's what they'd say about him. They might, I don't know if it's a speaking ability they were making fun of or what it might be, or his size or whatever, but it was saying, you are not impressive to us. That's what the false teachers would say. You write strong letters, but here you are weak in front of us. Paul was not a passive man. Paul was a strong man. He had successfully dealt with persecution. I mean, none of us have experienced anything like what he's experienced. He may have been probably the most persecuted person in all of Christian history. Before he had been saved, he was a persecutor, wasn't he? He wasn't a weakling. He successfully debated the apostles on the question of Gentile salvation. Rewind back to Acts chapter 15 when he went there. And he debated with the disciples about this whole issue of Gentile salvation. He faced stonings and beatings for the sake of the gospel, but he scattered the seeds of the gospel everywhere that he would go. And he started churches in Asia. He trained pastors. And in his spare time, he wrote half the New Testament. Now, what was God doing with him in some of those times while he was in prison? God allowed him to be in prison so he could write. And we are blessed to be able to have the blessing of what he wrote. Paul was a human dynamo. He was what I would say a mover and a shaker for the cause of Christ. I want to close with these 5 statements. 5 principles to remember, I think, when you're going through the difficult moments. First of all, they are divine appointments. Your disruptive moments is a divine appointment that you have with God. Second thing is that progressing without pain is usually not possible. Growing without pain is usually not possible. You go into the gym and you're working out and it's no pain, no what? No gain. No pain, no gain. The promise of God is the provision of grace. Remember that. And that these moments produce within us a dynamic growth in our relationship with Jesus. I tell you, when you go through these times, where do you find yourself? When you go through these moments, where have you found yourself more during these times? On your face, right? On your knees before God. growing, though, in your relationship with Him. And what we receive from these moments, what we receive from these moments that we're going through depends on how we respond to them. Whether we're going to become bitter and angry, or whether we're going to be saying, God, would you teach me through these times? I'm going to ask you to bow your heads, and I'm going to ask you to take just a moment as you think about this message tonight and where you are and what you've been through, what you're going through right now. Would we just take time to realize that it's God appointed? Had some God appointed moments in our life. And that we would say to God, God, would you teach me? Would you teach me? Would you grow me through this time right now? I don't want to become angry. I don't want to become bitter. Or maybe even we need to confess our anger and our bitterness. But we would say to God, God, I want to grow through this. I want to give you glory. I want to give you honor. You may not be going through the storm right now. It may not be one of those moments right now. But you're going to go through one. Do we need to make the commitment tonight to say, God, I want to grow through those times in my life? Father, I thank you for allowing